We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
It was just 7.5 years ago that President John F. Kennedy set this country on a course for the moon, with the goal of landing by the end of the decade. Tomorrow morning, weather permitting, 3 Americans start on man's first trip to the moon.
This is a CBS News special report. The flight of Apollo 8, 6 days to the moon and back. Tonight, a look ahead at man's first journey to the moon, brought to you by Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell system, as part of their continuing coverage of important news events. Reporting from CBS News, Apollo headquarters at Kennedy Space Center, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. The countdown for Apollo 8 is on. The clocks in the Launch Control Center here started on schedule at 9:51 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, counting off the final hours before 3 men are to start on that historic first journey to the moon at 7:51 a.m. tomorrow morning. Earlier today, problems with Apollo 8's fuel cells threatened the flight, but they were solved. And then there was worry about the weather. Fog was predicted for launch time, and because visual tracking is a must for the first few seconds of the launch, that could have caused a delay. But later tonight, the forecast improved, and the chances appear bright for an on-time departure for the moon tomorrow morning. If the mission should have to be canceled by weather tomorrow, however, another try will be made on Sunday morning, and that would put the astronauts in orbit around the moon on Christmas Day. Commanding the mission, Air Force Colonel Frank Borman. He's been in space once before, making the 14-day Gemini 7 mission 3 years ago. Borman is 40, married, and has 2 teenage sons. Number 2 man in the spacecraft, Navy Captain James Lovell. He was Borman's co-pilot on Gemini 7 and then commanded Gemini 12. He has spent 425 hours in space, more than any other human. And after Apollo 8, will by himself have spent more time in space than all of the Soviet Union's cosmonauts. He is 40, married, and has 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The third man up is Air Force Major William Anders, a rookie. This flight to the moon, his first trip into space. Anders is 35, married, and has 5 children, 4 boys and a girl. Their mission is the most difficult ever attempted and the most dangerous. They start with man's first ride aboard that 36-story Saturn V. 2 other Saturn V's have been launched successfully, and the rocket now is judged ready to carry men. From the launch pad into orbit, 11.5 minutes, ending with Apollo 8 still connected to its 3rd stage. It will stay in Earth orbit for almost 2 revolutions while the crew makes sure that everything is working satisfactorily. Then, almost 3 hours after liftoff, near Hawaii, the 3rd stage engine will be restarted, driving Apollo 8 out of its Earth orbit and onto a course for the moon. If the engine fails, or some fault in Apollo 8 itself causes mission controllers to call off the try for the moon, the spacecraft will spend up to 10 days circling the Earth. But if that engine works properly, Borman, Lovell, and Anders are on the way toward their rendezvous with the moon, crossing some 230,000 miles of space in 66 hours. Making minor course corrections if needed on the way. Then, 69 hours after launch, Apollo 8 will be just 70 miles from the moon. At this point, its rocket engine will be fired, slowing it for lunar orbit just before 5 a.m. next Tuesday morning, the day before Christmas. During this critical maneuver, the spacecraft is behind the moon, not in contact with mission control here on Earth, and so it won't be known for almost 20 minutes if the engine started, if it fired long enough, and if Apollo 8 is indeed in orbit around the moon. If the engine doesn't start, or if the astronauts detect something wrong and elect not to start it, they merely will swing around the moon and start back to Earth. If it does work, the astronauts will start up to 20 hours in moon orbit, circling the moon once every 2 hours at 3,700 miles an hour. Their first 2 orbits will be egg-shaped, and then on the 3rd, the orbit will be made circular, 70 miles high. While in this orbit, in addition to taking man's first close-up look, the astronauts will send back television pictures twice and take hundreds of photographs and motion pictures, concentrating on areas where future Apollo astronauts plan to land. Early Christmas morning, the most critical maneuver will take place. Apollo's rocket engine will be restarted in order to take the astronauts out of lunar orbit and start them back toward Earth. Now that maneuver, like the one that put them into orbit, will be done while the spacecraft is behind the moon, out of contact with Earth. So it won't be until Apollo 8 races back around the moon that we will know if the engine worked perfectly and that the crew is indeed on the way back home. If that rocket fails, the men will be trapped in moon orbit as surely as would earlier astronauts have been trapped in Earth orbit if their retro rockets had failed. Once started back, the return flight will take 58 hours. During that time, several mid-course corrections may be made to make sure that Apollo 8 enters the atmosphere at the correct and the critically precise angle. If it comes in too steeply, the sudden braking against the atmosphere could crush the astronauts. Or if the approach is too shallow, the spacecraft will skip off the atmosphere like a stone off water, go back into space, and the astronauts will be lost. After a successful entry into the atmosphere at speeds up to 25,000 miles an hour, when temperatures on the heat shield will get up to 4,000 degrees, next Friday, 6 days after liftoff, the spacecraft will drop into the Pacific Ocean 1,000 miles from Hawaii. And appropriately enough, the nearest spot of land will be Christmas Island. Many have wondered why the space agency has chosen to fly this mission during the Christmas holidays. Well, the answer is simple. Only once each month are the Earth and the Moon in the right position for there to be sunlight on the Moon, the launch site, and the recovery area at the right times. That period begins tomorrow. The crew is ready, the rocket is ready, the spacecraft is too. If there were no launch this month, a similar mission could not be flown until the middle of next month, delaying the moon landing program by a month when there are not that many months left if the United States is to meet its goal of man on the moon by the end of the decade. More on the flight of Apollo 8 in a moment.
There's one traffic network in this country where there are almost never any traffic jams. The Bell Telephone Network, with equipment made and supplied by Western Electric. Oh, the Bell System network has traffic problems, too, like over 300 million phone calls a day. But there are millions of routes to choose from, and there's switching equipment to get you through.
I'm glad I got through so fast. I'll never make that plane. You wouldn't believe this traffic, bumper to bumper.
Western Electric. We make Bell telephones. We also make equipment for the network that keeps your phone calls from getting stuck in traffic. Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System.
That Saturn V out there is the biggest rocket that man has ever built. It is 363 feet tall from tail to its tip. It is 5 times as powerful as the Saturn I that launched Apollo 7. Its first stage alone produces 7.5 million pounds of thrust. That first stage alone is 24 times more powerful than the Atlas that lifted John Glenn into orbit. The second stage, producing by itself 1 million pounds of thrust. And the third stage that gives Apollo its final kick out of Earth orbit and on the way to the moon. Almost 250,000 pounds of thrust there. The Saturn and its spacecraft payload will weigh at launch over 6 million pounds, as much as a Navy destroyer. It will take the equivalent of 100 tank cars full of liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, and kerosene to fuel it. And if something went wrong on the pad, this huge skyrocket could explode with the force of a small nuclear weapon, an explosion equal to almost 2.5 million pounds of TNT. Because of that, great attention has been given to getting the astronauts away from that pad in a hurry.
There are 3 ways it could be done. The first and the fastest is to use the escape tower atop Apollo 8. the solid fuel rockets in that tower would yank the spacecraft away from the booster in less than a second. Then, as shown here in an unmanned test, the spacecraft would float back to Earth on its parachutes. But if there were time, the escape tower would not be used. Instead, once the word had been given to abandon the spacecraft, the crew would leave the White Room, walk across the access arm, and then make one of two choices. If the problem were below them, an indication of trouble in the booster rocket, they and the six-man support crew from the White Room would hook onto a slide wire that would take them more than 2,000 feet away from the pad in less than 30 seconds. In this test, 3 dummies took that ride down the 2,250-foot wire, hitting a top speed of 70 miles an hour before automatically braking to a halt. At the end of the wire, armored personnel carriers would be standing by to race the men even farther away from the pad. The third method of escape is more conventional, a high-speed elevator that will take the astronauts down more than 400 feet to the base of the launch pad in just 45 seconds. There, they'd step into an escape slide, sliding down at 35 miles an hour and arriving just 8 seconds later in this blast room buried below the pad. In here, as many as 20 men could stay alive for 24 hours, with enough food and air to keep them going until rescue crews got to them through the regular entrance or tunneled down to them. The blast room is small and cramped. It's hot. The temperature is never less than 86 degrees, and since it must be sealed off from the danger of fire, it can't be air-conditioned. The floor is mounted on heavy springs to help absorb the shock of an explosion, and it shakes when someone walks across it. An eerie and uncomfortable place, but a safe haven and just 90 seconds away from the Apollo 8 spacecraft.
Adding to the danger of this mission after launch is that for the first time, the astronauts will be as far as 3 days away from the Earth. In the past, in Earth orbit, if something went wrong, the crew could return almost immediately. But once Apollo 8 is on the way to the moon, the time to get back if something important fails, the oxygen supply, for instance, gets longer and longer until it reaches that maximum of almost 3 days. And that's why it was not until Apollo 7's perfect mission, called 101% successful, that Apollo 8 was committed to tomorrow's flight to the moon. At Downey, California, where Apollo was made, in our full-scale mock-up, Bill Stout and North American Rockwell test astronaut Leo Krupp can tell us about what has been done to guarantee that everything does work. Bill?
Obviously, guarantees are hard to come by in this vehicle, in this program, but Leo, how close can we come?
Bill, I feel we can come very close because we've had a flight test program going for the past 5 years, starting with the Apollo abort missions at White Sand, and then the Apollo Saturn V launches at Cape Kennedy. These tests on the flight hardware have shown that the flight hardware does perform satisfactorily. In parallel with the flight test program, here at Downey, we've been doing engineering evaluations in our simulator where we take each one of the spacecraft systems and we thoroughly check it out in the simulator to make sure it performs properly, and that if a failure should occur, the crew will be able to take over manually, recognize the failure, take over manually, and control the vehicle.
But with all these built-in safety factors, Leo, isn't it true that once they circle the moon, assuming they do, either that one engine works to bring them back or they stay there forever?
That's true. The service propulsion system must function to get out of lunar orbit. However, this engine is completely redundant, and it has been flight tested and ground tested satisfactorily, and there's every reason in the world to believe it will perform satisfactorily on this mission.
So, no guarantees then, but at the same time, every assurance, every precaution that could possibly be provided. Walter?
So tonight, 3 men stand on the threshold of man's greatest journey. If successful, this flight will prepare the way for man's first landing on the moon. It also will place this country well ahead in the race for the moon. It will be not only a great scientific achievement, but a significant propaganda victory. The countdown right now is exactly on schedule. And if it stays that way and weather permits, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders begin their epic 6-day journey at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll be here starting at 7 a.m. to report on the launch and every major event along the way to the moon and back. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
This has been a CBS News special report, The Flight of Apollo 8, brought to you by Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System, the people who provide telephones and equipment that connects them. This is CBS.
They spend the night. Good sleep? Good sleep, right. Can you tell me what they did last night before going to bed?
They had dinner about 5:30 and sat around a little bit. Got to bed around 7:30 to 8. We got them up at 2:36 right on time, and everything right on schedule from there.
It's a good sound sleep on the part of all of them, though.
As far as we know, right.
How about the medical exam this morning?
We got through that in good shape, no problem.
And breakfast?
Yeah, we had the normal breakfast, scrambled eggs and steak and orange juice and toast, coffee.
Good, hearty breakfast they had.
Oh, yeah, right.
What kind of mood are they in? Well, how would you describe their mood?
Flying, they're ready to fly. Everything's looking good. See a few stars shining up there, and that's going to make them happy.
Do they know about that, about the good weather?
Right, just treat them.
Any of them going to be taking any little mementos or souvenirs up there? Have they packed anything into their suits like's been done on past shots?
Nothing in their suits, but we have a personal preference kit, and they do have some little goodies in that which are personal, and it's the choice as to whether they talk about it or not post-flight, but we know what's in there.
Were there any phone calls this morning from anywhere?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So in general, they're optimistic.
Yes, yeah.
And anxious to get started.
Ready to fly.
All right. Thanks very much.
Certainly.
Donald K. Slayton,
about 10 minutes early, too. They'll be down.
Why is it that you're early?
Well, things are moving smooth. They're about 25 minutes ahead on the pad, and so we're just going to pick up a little more time. We'll give ourselves all the cushion we can. Everybody wants to fly at 7:51, and so if we got a little time, we're going to take advantage of it.
And you think you'll make it at 7:51?
We're planning to. Sir.
Thanks, sir.
You betcha.
Okay, Slayton, the Director of Flight Operations here at the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'll get down with some other over something like that. Make room for two more of that.
And counting, the spacecraft test conductor, Dick Prophet, has advised that the prime crew is now leaving the suit room, and we should expect them downstairs ready to board their transfer van in just a matter of a short time. This is launch control, the prime crew coming out of the crew quarters. First Frank Borman, a wave from Frank, also Jim Lovell, and the final man aboard the transfer van, astronaut Bill Anders. They're being joined by two suit technicians, and we expect the door in the transfer van to be closed shortly. Astronaut Deke Slayton, Director of Flight Crew Operations, also aboard the transfer van. He'll drop off here at the control center. The transfer van now departing from the manned spacecraft. The sequence the astronauts will follow when they arrive at the pad will be as follows. All three will board a high-speed elevator, and the elevator, controlled by the capsule communicator, astronaut Vance Brand, here in the firing room, will carry the crew to the 320-foot level above the launcher base at Pad A. Actually, this is another 100 feet above the ground, so the level itself, what is referred to as the 320-foot level, is perhaps some 420 feet above sea level. The 320 feet referred to is 320 feet above the launcher base. Once that elevator arrives at the 320-foot level, astronauts Borman and Lovell, astronauts Borman and Anders will depart from the elevator and proceed along a catwalk to the White Room. Astronaut Jim Lovell will stand by in the elevator, sitting in a chair. The reason here is, of course, on the crew ingress, Lovell, who is the final man to come aboard, would have a wait of some 5 or 10 minutes in the White Room as his fellow pilots came aboard first, so we keep him in the elevator seated on a chair with a suit technician. The spacecraft commander, Frank Borman, will be the first to go aboard. He will be followed by the lunar module pilot, the man in the third seat, the seat on the right as we look at the spacecraft, astronaut Bill Anders. The final man aboard, the command module pilot, Jim Lovell. Astronaut Lovell will be called to the White Room once his two fellow pilots are aboard the spacecraft. The Apollo 8 crew now on the way to the pad. Our countdown is go at this time. All appears well with the Saturn V launch vehicle, the spacecraft checkout, weather conditions, tracking operations, and also the Mission Control Center in Houston reporting go as far as all their aspects of the flight are concerned. Still aiming for a planned liftoff time at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control at 2 hours, 55 minutes, 38 seconds, and counting. Astronauts Frank Borman and Bill Anders now going across swing arm 9, the top swing arm at the launch pad, and, of course, the access arm that attaches to the Apollo spacecraft. They're accompanied by one of the two suit technicians, astronaut Jim Lovell remaining in the elevator with one suit technician. Jim sits in a chair in the elevator while his two fellow pilots go aboard the spacecraft. Once Borman and Anders are aboard the spacecraft, Lovell is then called to the White Room across the swing arm. The process of boarding the spacecraft commander, Frank Borman, will be the first to come aboard. Borman and Anders now have arrived in the White Room and will be going aboard the spacecraft shortly. The spacecraft commander goes aboard first in the left-hand seat. Then the lunar module pilot, Bill Anders, will be the second pilot aboard in the number 3 seat. Jim Lovell is then called to the White Room, and he is the third and final member, of course, to come aboard the spacecraft. We're standing by for crew ingress at this time at 2 hours, 54 minutes, 25 seconds and counting. This is Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, 2 hours, 51 minutes, 32 seconds, and counting. Frank Borman, the spacecraft commander, now standing by to come aboard the spacecraft. We expect he'll be going in shortly. He's now standing in front of the hatch. Before he turned his back, he did give a wave to the closeout crewman up in the White Room. We expect he'll be coming into the cabin shortly. Once the crewmen do get aboard, once the astronauts do get aboard, they first, of course, have to set up their harnesses and tie into the spacecraft. They then tie in to the suit loop. This is, they bring the oxygen into their spacesuit, actually pressurize the suit. We sample the oxygen in the suit to assure that it is acceptable. These are some of the early steps once the astronauts get aboard. Also, early checks once the astronauts are tied into the circuit and now become a part of the actual countdown. Some communication checks and verifications that we are getting good biomedical readouts, good biomedical parameters from the astronauts on board. So we are standing by at this time for crew ingress at 2 hours, 50 minutes, 20 seconds, and counting. This is Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, 2 hours, 49 minutes, 20 seconds and counting. The spacecraft commander, astronaut Frank Borman, is now aboard the Apollo 8 spacecraft. We had it logged over the sill at 4:58 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Frank is now checking in with spacecraft test conductor Dick Proffitt on some communication checks. Astronaut Bill Anders, the lunar module pilot, the man in the number 3 seat, now standing by to come aboard. And Bill Anders is now boarding the spacecraft. The time we have is 2 minutes past the hour, 5:02 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Bill Anders now coming aboard. Jim Lovell standing by in the elevator at the 320-foot level. We expect he will be called to the White Room shortly. Lovell, the command module pilot, sits in the middle seat and is the last of the 3 pilots to come aboard. Bill Anders is now aboard and standing by for the arrival of the command module pilot, Jim Lovell. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, coming up on 2 hours, 43 minutes and counting. Astronaut Jim Lovell, the 3rd member of the crew, now is aboard the spacecraft. We had him logged across the sill at 5:07 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Actually, we have 4 astronauts in the spacecraft at this time. In addition to the Apollo 8 crew, astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, astronaut Fred Hayes, the backup lunar module pilot, also is aboard the spacecraft. Hayes is located in a lower equipment bay that's in front and below of the command module pilot's position. That is astronaut Jim Lovell. Fred Hayes will remain in the spacecraft for a while. He helps strap in the astronauts once their suits are pressurized, and also he checks a few switches during the countdown procedure. Hayes works with spacecraft test conductor Dick Prophet in checking several switches. The reason he is aboard for this purpose is because of the location of the couches at this time and the fact that the suits will be pressurized. Astronaut Jim Lovell cannot reach several of these switches that are in front and below as far as his position is concerned. So in reality, 4 astronauts are aboard, but Fred Hayes, a member of the closeout crew, will be coming out in a few minutes from this time. All 3 astronauts aboard, our countdown continuing. We are still go for the mission at this time. This is launch control.
Six and a half years ago, John F. Kennedy set this nation on a course toward the moon. This morning, 3 Americans, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders, are on the verge of making man's first journey to the moon. The countdown to liftoff for Apollo 8 is now T-minus 50 minutes and counting. Weather appears fine, and now only a last-minute technical failure can prevent the start of the greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
You've got about 1:45.
Last night, these 3 astronauts went to bed quite early after a steak dinner, not knowing at all whether this flight would go this morning or not. The weather looked like it might not be cooperative. There might be low clouds and fog. But when they woke this morning at 2:36 for a steak breakfast again, they found that the weather was clear. The stars were out. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. The forecast now is there may be some broken clouds at around 2,000 feet. There could be a little early morning haze and fog, but it looks as if the 7:51 a.m. launch time set 4 months ago is going to be met, and perhaps on the dot, which has been the record of the Saturn launches so far. This will be, of course, man's first trip to the moon, and no words can really imply the drama of that. But it's also the first manned flight of the Saturn V, the largest rocket man has ever built. 36 stories high it is out there. It weighs more than 6 million pounds, and it has the explosive potential in its fuel of 2.5 million tons of TNT. This will be the second manned flight in the Apollo program, and it's the first manned flight from this moon port. And now an announcement from Mission Control.
Saturn Launch Control at T-minus 48 minutes and counting. T-minus 48, and we are go for the Apollo 8 countdown at this time. The crew in the spacecraft still performing some final checks. Astronaut Frank Borman, the spacecraft commander, just a few minutes ago gave a weather report of his own when he reported that the 3-man crew could barely see what looked like some pink clouds out the window. Borman had earlier asked for a weather report from spacecraft test conductor Dick Prophet. Meanwhile, here in the firing room at the Launch Control Center, some 3.5 miles from the launch pad, the countdown still progressing satisfactorily here, and the crew is gearing up for some final checks of the range safety command destruct system. These are the destruct elements aboard the various stages of the vehicle that would destroy the vehicle in flight if required, if the vehicle went off its trajectory. Of course, the astronauts would be aborted from the vehicle if such an event did occur. During this period, working with the Air Force Eastern Test Range tracking elements, We do check out the command safety receivers to assure that if such a condition were required, the abort system and the destruct system would actually be able to receive the signals and accomplish the job. The countdown is still proceeding. We're still aiming toward 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is Launch Control.
And that voice of Launch Control, which you'll be hearing through this morning, is that of Jack King. The astronauts left their headquarters some 5 miles from the launch pad at 4:32 this morning, and were finally buttoned in to the spacecraft at 5:07, just 2 hours ago. Since then, they have been conducting the checkout tests, which you heard Jack King mention a moment ago. They are now alone in the spacecraft. The heat shield around the spacecraft has been placed in place. They are connected to the service tower there by only one of the swing arms, that one with the white room around it, which would permit them to escape out that fashion and down the high-speed elevator if necessary. If there were another more serious malfunction, that launch tower would carry them away from the exploding booster and on down range for presumably a safe landing. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment. The purpose of this 580,000-mile voyage that is to begin from here in 44 minutes from now is to prove the capability of this Apollo spacecraft, of its 3-man crew, and of the ground tracking network to pave the way for man to first set foot on the moon, perhaps as early as July of next year. The astronauts have been busy this morning in the 4 hours and a half that they have been up. And let's take a look now at what the astronauts did earlier this morning. Here they are at breakfast with Deke Slayton, you see in the middle of your picture there, George Low. This is Frank Borman, the 40-year-old commander of this Apollo mission. And here is Jim Lovell, who has spent more time in space in 2 previous flights than any other human. I didn't get a picture of Bill Anders there, the 3rd man, who's 35 years old. Here is Borman, the first man to leave the suiting up area where they spent the last week. Jim Lovell is 2nd, and Bill Anders, the 35-year-old space rookie who has not made a flight before, is 3rd. As they get aboard this air-conditioned van, which brings them the 5 miles over here to the launch area. They're wearing that new Apollo space helmet, which we noted on the Apollo 7 flight, Wally Schirra and his colleagues. This was the countdown time you see here as these events took place, 2 hours and 58 minutes before launch. I'm afraid that picture is so dim here on my monitor, I can't really make it out for you. It was in the dark as they emerged at the launch pad, which is the first manned use of this moon port. My assumption is that there they are getting into the elevator. And there they are crossing the catwalk at the 360-foot level. That's 360 feet above the ground, over from the elevator in the service tower to the White Room, and here the injection into the spacecraft itself. This is the White Room crew, that crew that makes the final preparations for the spacecraft that you see. Frank Borman enters the spacecraft first. He's there at the hatch door. When he makes the entry, they call it in space lingo here at the moon port, going over the sill. He goes over the sill and into the spacecraft. He'll be followed into the spacecraft by Bill Anders. Borman sits over on the left, the three side-by-side couches as the spacecraft commander. Lovell sits in the center, and he gets in last. He is the spacecraft pilot. And then Bill Anders, who gets in second, sits over on the right, is the lunar module pilot. Now, there is no lunar module on this flight. That is the little bug which will eventually take two men down to the surface of the moon from the orbiting spacecraft. There is none being flown on this flight. Instead, in the place where it would be carried in the configuration of the big Saturn rocket and its third stage, and in the service unit, there will be carried water in ballast, which will represent a lot of the weight that the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, will weigh when it is ready for flight on the next mission. That will be Apollo 9 in late February or early March, which will test the LEM in Earth orbit. And then Apollo 10 will take the LEM out to the moon. That will be in May, probably, to within 50,000 feet of the moon's surface, but it is not scheduled to land. The countdown is T-minus 39 minutes to the launch of Apollo 8. We do have another announcement coming up from Mission Control. The voice will be that of Jack King.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control at T-minus 39 minutes and counting. T-minus 39, and we are go for our countdown for the Apollo 8 mission to the moon at this time. Just in progress as this announcement came up was another key milestone in our countdown preparations, the power transfer test. This is where we go from external power to the flight batteries aboard the Saturn V launch vehicle to assure that they are all working properly. Then, in order to preserve these batteries, we return again to external power. The final switch to internal power on the batteries occurs at about the 50-second mark in the count. There are some 14 batteries in the Saturn V. The Apollo 8 crew of astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders standing by in the spacecraft as this test is in progress. T-minus 38 minutes, 6 seconds and counting. This is Launch Control.
With launch scheduled for 7:51 a.m. Eastern Time, and it is now 7:13 Eastern Time. This Saturn V will boost the Apollo spacecraft into orbit around the Earth. It is scheduled to orbit twice and then take off for the moon. Some 2 hours and 55 minutes after launch, the moon commitment is made. 2.5 days out to the moon, a day in orbit around the moon, and then 2 days back for a landing in the Pacific on Friday morning. The flight of Apollo 8 includes several points of potentially great danger, of course. The launch of the huge Saturn V itself, the point when the spacecraft's engine must fire to break out of lunar orbit so the men can come home, and the final approach, returning to Earth, when Apollo must fly through that narrow entry corridor. CBS News correspondent David Shoemaker asked the astronauts to assess the risks. First, Frank Borman. Something about those three fellows. Frank Borman is a colonel in the Air Force. He's 40 years old. He's a West Pointer. He was born in Gary, Indiana, but he grew up in Tucson, Arizona, where his family took him because he had a lot of trouble with mastoid and tonsils and that sort of thing. And the Tucson air apparently cleared it up. But he went on to become a high school football quarterback on a state championship team. He helped earn money to go to West Point by picking berries, we're told. He was a member of the National High School Scholastic Society. He went to West Point, and at 150 pounds, he could hardly play big league football, but he was manager of the West Point championship teams of those years. He was married his old high school sweetheart, Susan Bugby, at Tucson. He has two boys, Frederick, 7, and Edwin, 15. He flew on Gemini 7 as the command pilot. He's been up once before. Jim Lovell, who is the spacecraft pilot, is a captain in the Navy. He's 40 also, just a few days younger than Borman, as a matter of fact. He went to Annapolis. He was born in Cleveland. He grew up in Milwaukee. He married his high school sweetheart, Marilyn Gerlich. They have 2 boys and 2 girls. And incidentally, Mrs. Lovell and the 3 oldest children, Barbara, 15, and James, 13, Susan, 10, they're here at the Cape to watch this launch. Jeffrey, 3, stayed home. Jeffrey, incidentally, was born just a few days after Lovell came back from the longest mission man has ever spent in space, a 14-day mission of Gemini 7. He also flew on Gemini 12, and he's got more time in space than any other individual, 425 hours and 10 minutes, almost 18 days in space. He's seen, incidentally, 224 sunrises, and now he's going to add 10 lunar sunrises as he makes this mission successfully, as hoped, of course. Bill Anders, who is the baby and the rookie of this bunch, is a major in the Air Force, also an Annapolis graduate. He's 35 years old. He was born in Hong Kong. His father was in the Navy, a commander, badly wounded in the Panay, a gunboat on the Yangtze that you may remember if you're old enough. Valerie Horde is his wife. She was from California, also a early sweetheart to Bill Anders. They have 5 children, 4 boys and a girl. Valerie is watching this mission, the first flight of her husband from their home in Houston. Incidentally, he, besides graduating from Annapolis, got a master's degree in nuclear engineering. He's an expert in that area. There's a countdown now, T-minus 32 minutes, a little over a half hour to the launch of this great Saturn V and its precious cargo of these 3 astronauts about whom we've just been talking. There was a little problem yesterday in the liquid oxygen supply to the fuel cells. That was cleared up, and then the worry all during the early hours of the night was whether the weather was going to be good today or not. Fog came in yesterday and blacked out in the early morning hours this launch pad. That wouldn't do for launch. They want to have visibility. They want to be able to see the rocket as it rises the first 2,000 feet, getting a radar track on it through a visual bore sight so that no ground scatter effect could interfere with that radar, because that radar is necessary to help trigger and decide on whether they go to an escape mode in case anything goes wrong in those first few seconds of flight. Well, the weather's good this morning, but we can get more details about the weather here in Florida from our weather consultant, Gordon Barnes, in our New York City Space Center. Gordon? Thank you, Gordon. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment. And the count is T minus 29 minutes and counting toward the 7:51 a.m. Eastern Time launch of the Apollo 8. Let me tell you something about what you're going to see in those dramatic moments as this Saturn V lifts off from Pad 39A here at Merritt Island. No longer Cape Kennedy or Cape Canaveral. We've moved over to Merritt Island for the moon port. That's an island right adjoining the Cape between the Banana and Indian rivers, a few miles from the Cape where all the previous manned launches have taken place. The Saturn V is the world's most powerful rocket, as we've said. 8,850,000 pounds of thrust in its 3 stages. Now, the best the Soviets have built, we believe, up to now is 2 to 3 million pounds of thrust, so we've far surpassed them, although there are reports that they may be building a rocket of 10 million pounds thrust. We don't expect to go any larger than this Saturn. It can do everything we want to do in space for the immediate future. The Saturn has flown twice before, the Saturn V, that is. In November 1967, its first flight, and here 3 miles from the launch pad, you may recall, if you were with us for that, our window shook so that we thought it was coming in on us, and our roof tiles collapsed in some places. It was quite a blast. That will be repeated again today. The second flight of the Saturn V was on April 4th of '68. The November '67 flight was 100% perfect. Everything went well, all 3 stages. The April flight was not so. 2 of the J2 engines in the second stage failed, and the single J2 engine in the third stage failed. They determined that it was a broken fuel line shaken loose in space, and they have replaced that now, quite obviously, with a different type of fuel line, and it is believed that all will go well this time. That second flight was a disappointment, but they're so confident now of their engineering capabilities that they are not concerned about another unmanned flight of the Saturn V before committing man, as they have now for this flight today. The Saturn V weighs 6,219,000 pounds at liftoff. No such weight has ever been lifted off the surface of the Earth before. It has the thrust equal to 100 million horsepower. If you can believe that, 130 million horsepower, I think, is the actual figure. It uses some 531,000 gallons of its fuel in just the 2.5 minutes of flight that the first stage is operative. That's something like 3,600 gallons a second. You get a lot of green stamps for that at your corner service station. The flight today, what you will be seeing in the ignition, the ignition takes place 9 seconds, 8.9 seconds to be precise, before the actual liftoff. 2 large arms are holding the rocket on the ground to build up the power before those arms come open and the rocket is on its own to take off. So there are 8.9 seconds of fire before you see the actual liftoff, and then that slow, majestic rise from the pad. I'll tell you more about it, but here's an announcement from Mission Control.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control at T-minus 26 minutes and counting. We are proceeding at this time. In progress at this time, we are pressurizing the propellants for the spacecraft engine systems that would be used in a space environment. Astronaut Jim Lovell, the man who sits in the middle of the seat and who is the command module pilot, is reporting back to spacecraft test conductor Dick Proffitt on the status of the propellants. We pressurize these propellants with helium. The countdown has been going very well since it was picked up at 10:51 p.m. Eastern Standard Time last night. Shortly before we resumed the count, the 9.8 million pound mobile service structure was moved to its park position some 7,000 feet from the pad. About an hour later, we began the propellant loading of the Saturn V launch vehicle. In some 4.5 hours, we loaded close to 1 million gallons total of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen aboard the 3 stages of the Saturn V. We now have a vehicle standing 363 feet, that is, and weighing 6.2 million pounds on the launch pad here at the Kennedy Space Center. We're continuing to top off the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen supplies because they must be maintained under extremely cold temperatures. They will continue to boil off, and we continue to replenish the supply down to the final minutes of the count. Astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were awakened in their crew quarters this morning at 2:36 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. They went down the hall from the crew quarters here at the Kennedy Space Center and took a physical examination, a brief launch day examination, and were declared physically fit by the 3 examining physicians, Drs. Alan Harder, Dr. Jerry Joyner, and Dr. Jack Teagan. The astronauts then sat down to breakfast. They had a menu of filet mignon, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, and tea. Guests at the breakfast included George Lowe, Apollo Program Director at the Manned Spacecraft Center, Donald K. Slayton, who's Director of Flight Crew Operations at the Manned Spacecraft Center, 2 of the backup pilots for the Apollo 8 mission, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Astronaut Jack Schmitt also attended the breakfast. Following the breakfast, the astronauts went to the suit room where they donned their spacesuits. The crew departed from the crew quarters at 4:32 a.m. this morning and began to
Jack
board
King is reviewing for you the detail that we gave you earlier of the astronauts' early morning activity. There is great excitement, of course, here at Cocoa Beach, Cape Kennedy, and Merritt Island, where this moon port is. There are 1,200 newsmen, including representatives from 22 nations are here. There are diplomats, ambassadors, and charge d'affaires from 69 nations present. 2 of the Supreme Court justices, Brennan and Stewart, are here, and 2 cabinet members, Labor's Wirtz and Agriculture's Freeman, the heads of the Atomic Energy and the Civil Service and the Federal Communications Commission, among 3,000 VIPs who were invited for this launch. And to my mind, the most V of all the VIPs, Charles Lindbergh, is here, who in 1927, 41 years ago, made that first solo flight across the Atlantic in an airplane with 232 horsepower compared to that 130 million horsepower of this thing sitting out there on pad 39A. There must be great excitement, too, at Houston, Texas, at the Manned Space Center. Nelson Benton is there. Nelson? Nelson, we got a report from the crew quarters, Apollo 8 crew quarters, yesterday evening that the men were exceedingly calm and that some people who had seen a lot of these flights had never seen such calm prevailing. And yet, last night, the acting head of the space program, Dr. Payne, told me that that everybody here at Cape Kennedy knows how much is riding on this one, not only in the safety of the mission itself, but in the whole future of the space program and in America's prestige in the space race. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment. is T minus 18 minutes and counting toward the launch of Apollo 8 at 7:51 a.m. Here's what this mission is all about. It's the toughest we've ever attempted, of course. This is man's attempt to get to the moon. Now, the moon is moving around the Earth, as you know, and the Earth and the moon both are moving around the sun. As a consequence, because the moon is moving around the Earth at some 230 miles distance, roughly, it varies a little bit, but at that distance, and taking off 2.5 days before landing there, obviously this flight has to be programmed to sort of lead the moon, like a duck shooter leading a duck. We've got to aim a little bit ahead of it and try to be there at the same time the moon gets there. And here's how the mission will be flown. This is the Earth. It's 24,890,000 miles circumference against the moon's 2,790 miles circumference, and this moon 230,000 miles away. The launch takes place from the Cape here, goes into orbit, Earth orbit, makes 2 loops around the Earth as the spacecraft systems are being checked out by the pilots. When they decide they're going to commit to lunar flight, they will fire off their 3rd stage engine, 200,000 pounds of it here, and that will take them out into what's called the translunar trajectory. They will drop that 3rd stage and then be on their own for the 2.5-day flight to the moon. They get to the moon, and out there they approach at 70 miles high. They fire their service propulsion system engine here. At this point, 20,500 pounds thrust it has, and that puts them first time into a circular orbit 70 miles high. They will continue that orbit for some 10 revolutions, 2 hours for each revolution, almost a full day in orbit around the moon. They fire that engine again back side of the moon, away from the control of the Earth. For 45 minutes of every 2-hour revolution, they are out of control from the Earth, and they fire back to come on the long trip back to Earth and land in the Pacific on next Friday morning. We think for you a most interesting patching together using the space that man has pioneered from here at Cape Kennedy through the communication satellites this morning. We have standing by 2 men on opposite sides of the Earth with opposite viewpoints on the importance of this flight of Apollo 8, of man going to the moon at this time. Sir Bernard Lovell is at Jodrell Bank in England, where he presides over that great telescope, radio telescope that pierces farther into the heavens than any other. He's opposed to this flight. And Dr. William Pickering at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, who favors it. Morley Safer is with Sir Bernard. So Morley, why don't you begin?
Bobby and the 11 go 2 minutes. Late. Yes. Yes. minutes crossing us up, my friend. Lovely. Okay, Walter's gonna come in. Does Annie confirm? You don't have Pickering's picture?
Sir Bernard, this is Walter Cronkite at Merritt Island in Florida at the launch complex. I'm very pleased, sir, to see you again, although at great distance. I enjoyed so much my visit with you there before. And now I'd like, Sir Bernard, to bring in Dr. William Pickering at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. Good morning, Dr. Pickering. Are you there? How are you, sir? Do you... I imagine you're looking upon this flight with great excitement after all the Jet Propulsion Laboratory has done to explore the moon with the unmanned vehicles. What do you see the significance of this flight other than the spectacular nature of man getting there? Dr. Pickering, I invite you to say good morning to Dr. Lovell. I'm afraid, Dr. Pickering, that we have lost the satellite. For the moment, we've lost the satellite picture, and perhaps it sounded as if we lost the audio with Dr. Lovell there, too. Dr. Pickering, as you know, we'll be coming back to you later in the morning after we get Apollo 8 successfully into orbit, and we'll look forward to talking to you then. Thank you, Dr. Pickering. The count is T minus 9 minutes now, and counting. Just 9 minutes. In fact, it's just 8 minutes now until the scheduled launch of the Apollo 8, and we hear from Mission Control that everything is go for this flight. If I could very quickly show you the magnitude of this flight, I'd like to do that. If I could give a warning to my stalwart director, Freddie Stolmack, down below here somewhere, I'd like to show you something. Over here on this globe of the moon, of the Earth, man, in the highest he's ever been off the surface of the Earth, in the flight of Gemini 11, was 850 miles high, and by the scale of this globe, that would be 3/4 of an inch. 3/4 of an inch off of that surface. You could use this little California. Good morning, Dr. Pickering. Are you there?
Good morning, Walter.
How are you, sir?
Just fine, thank you. It's early in the morning out here.
I imagine you're looking upon this flight with great excitement after all the Jet Propulsion Laboratory has done to explore the moon with the unmanned vehicles.
Yes, indeed. I regard this flight as of very major significance and a very important flight.
What do you see the significance of this flight other than the spectacular nature of man getting there?
Well, this is the next step in the series of steps which are going to lead to man eventually being on the moon and returning. And this Apollo mission today is obviously the most difficult step we've attempted yet, and perhaps the most important. And success in this mission is very important indeed for the future of the Apollo program.
Dr. Pickering, I invite you to say good morning to Dr. Lovell.
Good morning, Sir Bernard.
Good morning, Dr. Pickering. How are you?
Just fine. It's quite a while since I've seen you.
Yes, indeed. I expect you're all excited in America like we are here.
Oh, we're very excited at this flight, yes. All the way across America.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you think, Dr. Pickering, that...
I'm afraid, Dr. Pickering, that we have lost the satellite.
Oh.
For the moment, we've lost the satellite picture, and perhaps it sounded as if we lost the audio with Dr. Lovell there, too. Dr. Pickering, as you know, we'll be coming back to you later in the morning after we get Apollo 8 successfully into orbit, and we'll look forward to talking to you then.
Very good.
Thank you, Dr. Pickering.
Thank you.
The count is T minus 9 minutes now, and counting. Just 9 minutes. In fact, it's just 8 minutes now until the scheduled launch of the Apollo 8, and we hear from Mission Control that everything is go for this flight. If I could very quickly show you the magnitude of this flight, I'd like to do that. If I could give a warning to my stalwart director, Freddie Stolmack, down below here somewhere, I'd like to show you something. Over here on this globe of the moon, of the Earth, man, in the highest he's ever been off the surface of the Earth, in the flight of Gemini 11, was 850 miles high, and by the scale of this globe, that would be 3/4 of an inch. 3/4 of an inch off of that surface. Could use this little model just to kind of show you that. Just that, 3/4 of an inch. Now, if this were all in scale, this flight would be taking man this far. And I'm sorry, Freddie, I'm going right out of your lighting and everything else here, because it would go 30 feet instead of 3/4 of an inch, 30 feet out into space to reach the moon. What a flight. What a thing this flight of Apollo 8 will be. And what a remarkable achievement for the space program when you consider that we really got started only 7 years ago with the flight of the first Mercury on a Redstone rocket. And now, if I can take just a second, I'll show you where we are here as we watch this flight. We are here 3 miles from the launch pad, pad 39A, moonport here at Merritt Island near Cape Kennedy, the Kennedy Spacecraft Center, Space Center. Over there on the right, perhaps you can see, well, that body of water out there is incidentally is the barge canal that brings these great beasts here from their manufacturing point in Louisiana, Michaud, Louisiana. They go into a huge building over here at the left, in volume the largest building in the world, as large as the Pentagon and the Chicago Merchandise Mart put together. It's the Vehicle Assembly Building, and that's 3 miles, as we are, from the launch site. And it is where the Launch Control Center is, where the launch is controlled until the liftoff has been completed, when control shifts to the Manned Space Center in Houston, Texas. We're looking out southeast, roughly, and that will be the direction of the flight as it takes off and moves on up into space. Now, what you're going to see in these first few minutes, and it's T minus 6.5 minutes and counting now. Very shortly, we're going to go to Mission Control and listen to Mission Control's Jack King reporting on the first stages of the flight and the countdown, too. You'll see the liftoff, and as we told you before, there's almost 9 seconds, 8.9 seconds before the Saturn actually lifts off of the pad after ignition. You will then see it start a roll program in about 11 seconds. It begins to turn slightly, and you'll see the big black and white markings and the red lettering on the Saturn begin to turn a little bit as that roll begins. That's to get it right into the right azimuth. And then at 1 minute and 17 seconds, it goes through the maximum dynamic pressures on the launch phase. Now let's listen to Mission Control.
Control at 5 minutes, 30 seconds, and our count is still go at this time. We've just completed further status checks here in the firing room at the control center. Here in the control center, we've had our status checks, and the range has given a go, as has the launch director, Rocco Petrone. We are still counting, and we are go coming up on the 5-minute mark in the count. Mark, T-minus 5 minutes and counting, T-minus 5. At this point, the Apollo access arm should be coming back, and it is now moving back at the 320-foot level to its fully retracted position high atop the tower at Pad A. Our countdown still proceeding at this time at the 4-minute mark in the countdown. The overall count will be turned over to the launch vehicle test conductor. Ray Roberts, the launch vehicle test conductor, will conduct the final 4 minutes as all different aspects move over to the launch vehicle test conductor's channel. The automatic sequence, as reported, will come in at the 3-minute and 6-second mark in the countdown. We're standing by at 4 minutes, 16 seconds and counting. This is launch control.
As we were telling you, at 1 minute and 17 seconds into the flight, that's when you see the great contrail begin as the spacecraft begins to emerge from the deep atmosphere of Earth. It's called an area of maximum dynamic pressure, too, when the maximum buffeting takes place and when the stresses and strains on this big 363 feet of vehicle are the most intense. At that point, the big engines, the 5 engines of the first stage are gulping 3,000 gallons of fuel a second. Here's Jack King again.
30 seconds and counting. We have completed our communications checks with the Apollo 8 astronauts in the cabin, and the communications are go. Coming up shortly, we'll be in the automatic sequence where we have a completely automatic checkout of the launch vehicle from 3 minutes and 6 seconds down. We have firing command. The firing command is in. We are now on the automatic sequence, T-minus 3 minutes and counting. During this period, once we do get the firing command, the various tanks within the 3 stages of the Saturn V launch vehicle begin to pressurize. They all must be under pressure before we're ready to launch. We have a sequence status board here in the control room that will give us readouts on the overall status of the space vehicle as we reach the terminal phases in the countdown. Now, 2 minutes, 32 seconds, and counting. Our status board indicates that all aspects are ready. Instrument unit is ready, spacecraft ready. Final check of the emergency detection system, that ready light also on. First stage preparations are completed. 2 minutes, 15 seconds and counting. The tanks continuing to pressurize in the vehicle. Not as many reports coming now as we all stand by on the launch vehicle test conductor's channel. Coming up on the 2-minute mark on the Apollo 8 mission. 2 minutes and counting. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. We are still proceeding. We now have recorded that the first stage liquid oxygen tank has been pressurized and the pressure is still building up. 1 minute, 45 seconds and counting. We have a vehicle weighing 6.2 million pounds on the pad. Interestingly enough, some 1,200 pounds of that weight is just frost on the side of the vehicle created by the extremely low temperatures of the propellants. Coming up on 90 seconds, mark, T-minus 90 seconds and counting. The Apollo 8 crew standing by, spacecraft commander Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, Bill Anders. We now have a report that the liquid hydrogen tank on the 3rd stage is pressurized. 1 minute, 15 seconds. All 3rd stage propellants pressurized at this time as we come up on the 60-second mark on a flight to the moon. T-minus 60 seconds and counting. T-minus 60 seconds and counting. The vehicle now is completely pressurized. We're coming up on a power transfer shortly. T-minus 50 seconds and counting. We have the power transfer. We're now on the flight batteries within the launch vehicle. 45 seconds. Final reports coming from Frank Borman at this time. Final look at the switch list aboard the spacecraft. 35 seconds and counting. We'll lead up to an ignition sequence start at 8.9 seconds. This will lead up, as we build up the thrust, to a liftoff. If all goes well, it's 0. We've just passed the 25-second mark in the count. 20 seconds, all aspects. We are still go at this time. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are armed. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Looks good.
We've cleared the tower.
Oh, and there's the rumble in our building. It looks good. It looks like a good flight. It's a beautiful takeoff so far. This building is shaking under us. Our camera platform is shaking. But what a beautiful flight. Man, perhaps on the way to the moon, if all continues to go well. Buffeting we're taking here. It's probably more severe than the men in the spacecraft itself.
We're looking good. One minute, 15 seconds. Then we're a little more than half mile into the sky and about nearly 4 miles downrange.
You're now hearing the voice of Paul Haney at Mission Control in Houston. And our great VU cameras are picking up the spacecraft.
1 minute, 40 seconds. All looks great.
Now in 15 seconds, the inboard engine should cut off on that first stage. That's the one inboard engine, and then
6/10 into the mission, and Frank Borman has confirmed each event as it's been passed to him by Mike Collins at this point. The crew has been given a go for staging. Inboard out on time, Frank Borman says.
25
The
more
inboard
seconds.
engines.
The other 4 engines of the first stage should cut out.
2 minutes, 25 seconds.
The rocket then will be 20 miles high and going 3,000 miles an hour. And there is the staging.
An S1C, the first stage cut off. S2 has ignited, we can confirm. And the thrust looks good. All engines, all sources show the second stage is burning perfectly.
They had their
51 seconds into the mission.
They had their fingers crossed for that one. It was 2 of the engines that failed on the second stage in the second flight of the Apollo.
The flight range safety console has been released at the key. 3 minutes into the flight, we're 50 miles high and about 10 miles downrange. 3 minutes, 25 seconds. We have verified that the tower has jettisoned. The crew has verified the tower is jettisoned.
That's the launch escape tower, which if there had been a disastrous explosion before this, would have pulled the spacecraft free.
He says the ride now is even smoother.
When the spacecraft, when the launch escape system jettisoned, it pulled away the cover which had covered the command module to protect it from the 1,200-degree heat of this escape from the Earth.
4 minutes into the flight, and the communication thus far has been excellent. It's been a little sparse, but it's been quite sharp and clear.
They're now a good 500 miles downrange.
Altitude and about 20 miles or more downrange.
They should be making 5,400 miles an hour.
200 miles downrange.
Yes, I think that's more likely. The next important event of the flight is the cutoff of the second stage engines. That comes 8 minutes and 40 seconds into the flight, or about 4 minutes from now.
Gets an enthusiastic go from both trajectory and booster at 4 minutes 50 seconds into the flight.
It's been a beautiful takeoff. Everything apparently going sensationally well.
Mark, 5 minutes.
The first really dangerous point of this flight has passed.
The crew's advisor, trajectory and guidance are looking good, and Frank Borman came back with a very chatty thank you, Michael. He's talking to Michael Collins, who would be in the center seat today except for an operation several months ago. 5 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight.
Go to the animation.
If anything went amiss now, the spacecraft...
300 miles downrange, we're nearing 100 miles altitude, and everything looks just grand.
The spacecraft at this point could separate and come back in a normal re-entry. It is building up toward orbital speed now, and at this point should be at around...
Collins gives the crew another go on trajectory and guidance, which at this point are the most critical elements. It's 6 minutes, 10 seconds into the flight. Our downrange distance now 400 miles. Our velocity in feet per second, nearly 15,000 feet per second. We've achieved nearly 60% of the velocity required to make orbit. 57% right now.
Around 12,000 miles an hour.
And we're 96.5 miles above the Earth.
The orbital speed required to orbit the Earth to balance between the centrifugal force going on out into space and the gravity of Earth is 17,500 miles an hour. That's the speed that they must achieve to go into Earth orbit.
Surgeon reports he likes everything he sees. 7 minutes into the flight.
So
and we're nearing the second stage. Nearing the point where we will drop off the second stage and light the third stage.
This third stage engine lighting is a critical point.
Come at about 8 minutes and 40 odd seconds into the flight.
It is the third stage that must boost the spacecraft out into the translunar trajectory.
70% of the velocity required to attain orbit. Our present velocity is 18,600 feet per second, and we are 100 miles above the Earth, 100 even. 625 miles downrange.
If there's any doubt when this third stage fires that it is working properly, it could mean that the mission could not go on to the moon. That decision could be made at that point.
Coming up on 8 minutes, Mark, 8 minutes.
So they will be watching this third stage firing now in about 30 seconds from now very, very carefully. The third stage is
20,400 feet per second, 101.7 miles above the Earth, 734 miles downrange.
And third stage engines of J2 develops 230,000 pounds of thrust. Burns about 2.5 minutes to bring the vehicle to orbital speed and altitude. And this is the stage that has to reignite later for the translunar injection. Should be time for that staging right now.
And the crew is advised they look good on the ground for staging. And Borman says, same here. We got S2 cutoff, we got S4B ignition. Borman confirmed S4B ignition.
So the third stage has ignited.
Good, at 9 minutes into the flight.
That's the first step. Now, if it develops its full power, they will confirm that the S-4B is ready to be shut off.
We now have 89% of the velocity required. We're 920 miles downrange. And we're 9 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight.
This engine will be shut off in another minute and a half approximately, and then to be restarted.
Flight dynamics officer says our altitude is nominal, which is the typically conservative word for very nearly a perfect mission, as nearly as we can observe at this point. 9 minutes, 50 seconds, and we've just gone to what we call mode 4. If any trouble should develop now, we would go ahead and burn into orbit with our service propulsion engine. The crew is now being advised we plan to cut off the third stage engine at 11 minutes, 28 seconds into the flight. We're now at 10 minutes, 10 seconds. We're at 103.7 nautical miles above the Earth. Our velocity is at an even 24,000 feet per second, which is just very, very close to orbital velocity. That's 95% of it. And we're 1,200 miles downrange. So it put us out a little bit east of Bermuda.
If that third stage should not function properly, and they did use the service propulsion system, that's a 20,500-pound thrust engine, to go into orbit, it would mean that they would not refire for the lunar trip.
How do you read Houston? And he gets a looking good back from a looking good comment from Mike Collins. Minutes, 20 seconds.
That third stage cutoff should come any second now.
And we're hearing a little something from Jim Lovell reporting a reading on one of his many gauges. We have SECO, says Frank Borman. SECO, and I would call it 11 minutes, 30 seconds.
That's the engine cutoff.
That will be an estimate. 11 minutes, 30 seconds. Our launch digital data shows our velocity now 25,577 feet per second. The data now has been reduced, and we show an altitude of 102.5. And the crew has been given a go for orbit, and they responded enthusiastically that they too, in fact, were go.
So they've got to go for orbit. They're half a mile off of their planned 103-mile orbit at 102.5 miles, not significant at all. They're a few miles an hour slower than their planned 17,500 velocity for orbit, not significant at all. This flight of Apollo 8 in its first stages has gone exceedingly well, and it augurs well for the remainder of the flight.
Jim just read us down what he saw on his instrumentation. He shows an apogee of 102.6, a perigee of 96.8, and a cutoff velocity of 25,560 feet per second. That's within hundredths of a percentage point of what we were reading on our scales here in Houston.
So now, for the next orbit and a half, these men will be testing out their spacecraft systems, their air and water supply, their communications, their computers, their various thrusters on their attitude control. And if all of these things seem to be working well, and now they apparently have a good third stage there, they will decide in the next 2 hours whether or not to go for the moon. If so, they will fire those engines 2 hours and 55 minutes after the takeoff, or in other words, at about 9:45 Eastern Time this morning. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment.
Clean air. Clean water. They're worth fighting for. At Western Electric plants, all across the country, we've been fighting for cleaner air and water for years. Fighting pollution doesn't make the telephone equipment Western Electric builds for the Bell telephone companies any better. But we breathe a little easier knowing you do.
The flight of Apollo 8 continues after this pause for station identification. This is CBS. CBS News coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 continues. Here is Walter Cronkite at Kennedy Space Center.
What a launch that was. That magnificent Saturn V, the third perfect launch from the Cape here, taking into orbit the Apollo 8 spacecraft and the 3 astronauts who plan to take that spacecraft to the moon and back during this Christmas week. The orbit is almost perfect at 118 by 123 statute miles above the Earth. You heard the report from Mission Control in Houston of 102 and 106 miles. Well, those were nautical miles. It's 118 by 123 statute miles. The speed is almost perfect, just a little under the 17,500 miles an hour that was desired, but well within the range for Earth orbit. And now this revolution and a half, during which the astronauts and ground control will determine if all of the spacecraft machinery is functioning properly, and they should be committed to man's first journey to the moon. The next important function then will be the determination of that commitment. If it is committed, the translunar injection, so-called, the beginning of the flight to the moon itself will come at 10:41 Eastern Standard Time. I think I said 9:41 a little earlier. It's not. It's 10:41. That's 2 hours and 50 minutes after this blast-off. The flight to the moon will take 2.5 days, as you undoubtedly know by now. We've mentioned it several times. This is a $315 million effort getting this Apollo 8 up, and so far it looks like it's worth it. Everything has gone perfectly. There are some 2.5 to 3 million parts in that Saturn V, and you can't have even a 1% error, because you can see how many parts that would mean would be malfunctioning. There's got to be virtually no error to get off successfully, and this flight certainly went well. With all of the ground control people and equipment, there were no problems. The spacemen now, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Ed Enders, are riding there in their 210 cubic feet of the Apollo spacecraft. That's about 70 cubic feet to a man. A compact car would give you 68 cubic feet to a person, so you can see about what they have to live in for this next historic week. In the Gemini spacecraft, they just had 40 cubic feet a man, and in the Mercury, just 55. This spacecraft is, however, a transcontinental bus compared to a compact car when you compare the various sizes of spacecraft that have been up so far. They've got hot and cold running water there in the spacecraft. They've got a vacuum cleaner to keep the dust down and the debris out of the spacecraft. The center couch, the one that Lovell occupies, can be folded up so that they have standing room to perform navigational sightings and get a little exercise. Hammocks are slung under their seats so that they can sleep away from the chores that are going on at the consoles themselves. This is a so-called open-end mission that they're flying. That means that there are many commit points along the flight plan. One of the commit points has already taken place. Two of them have, as a matter of fact. First, the launch, and second, the orbital insertion around the Earth. The next commit point is the one of which we have spoken, translunar injection. That is, firing off the third stage engine again with its 230,000 pounds of thrust to boost out of Earth orbit to come almost close to the escape velocity from the Earth's gravitational pull. Not quite. They don't want to do that. If they escaped the Earth's gravitational pull entirely, then they would have to depend upon their engines to get home, and if they failed, they could not. This way, they can go out to the moon and be captured by the moon's gravity. In a sort of a slingshot maneuver, the moon's gravity would pull them halfway around the moon, but would not be strong enough to hold them in orbit. So they'd fly off again, such as the orbital mechanics, and come back being caught by the Earth's gravity again to a safe landing if they did nothing more after that translunar injection. They plan to do more, of course. They plan to fire off their service propulsion engine on the far side of the moon when they'll be out of touch of the Earth communications network on the back side of the moon. They'll make that decision, put themselves into lunar orbit. That's a retrograde maneuver, so-called. They slow down so that they do not fly off from the lunar orbit again, but stay in lunar orbit, balancing carefully between the moon's gravity and their own centrifugal force. Then they circularize that orbit, and then that engine does have to fire one more time, and that's the important one. After they have made their 10 orbits of the moon, that engine fires behind the far side of the moon again. And if that firing is successful, the spacecraft is sent on its way back toward Earth. If the engine does not work on that particular firing, however, the astronauts and their Apollo 8 spacecraft could be caught in lunar orbit forever. And since their life support system aboard the spacecraft could only last 5 or 6 more days, that would mean a tragic termination of this flight. Of course, nobody is anticipating that. But it is one of the hazards that has to be constantly kept in mind. Also, they are flying for the first time. Man is making his first trip through the deep radiation of space out to beyond the so-called Van Allen belt, which is a belt at the outer fringes of our atmosphere that captures the radiation from the solar system and holds it in a rather thick belt. It is not believed that they are in any danger from this radiation, nor from solar flares, because of the heavy spacecraft covering behind which they are shielded. If, however, they were getting out of the spacecraft, such as making a landing on the moon, then the solar flare activity, these periods of intense radioactivity from the sun, could be dangerous to them. However, we have a big tracking network of astronomers around the world keeping tabs on the solar flare activity. It's called the Solar Flare Network, as a matter of fact, and they say that no solar flare activity is expected during the course of this flight. Now let's take a look at the launch, which took place just almost 25 minutes ago here at the Merritt Island Kennedy Space Center.
We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have cleared the top.
Tower clear, 13 seconds.
First the voice of Jack King there, now Paul Haney.
We get allowed to clear Frank Borman. 32 seconds.
Right at this point, we were taking a...
want to see the first stage looks good.
We were taking a terrific buffeting here in our Space Center CBS News Space Center.
Their progress at 50 seconds into the flight. One minute out, Mike Collins tells the crew we're looking good. One minute, 15 seconds, and we're a little more than half mile into the sky and about nearly 4 miles downrange.
Seems almost inconceivable. 6.5 million pounds, the weight of that vehicle. $130 million horsepower
1 minute,
takes to get it off the ground.
All looks great. Mile and 6/10 into the mission, and Frank Borman has confirmed each event as it's been passed to him by Mike Collins at this point. The crew has been given a go for staging. Inboard out on time, Frank Borman says. The inboard engines. 2 minutes, 25 seconds. We see an S1C, the first stage cut off. S2 has ignited, we can confirm. And the thrust looks good. All engines, all sources show the second stage is burning perfectly. 2 minutes, 51 seconds into the mission. And the 3 minutes into the flight, the range safety console has been released at a key. 3 minutes into the flight, we're 50 miles high.
And the flight of Apollo 8 was well on its way. That great Saturn V is incidentally 112 times as powerful as the Redstone, which lifted Alan Shepard, later Gus Grissom, into their 15-minute suborbital flights back in 1961 and began the U.S. manned space program. We have confirmed from Houston now the official orbital figures, and they are almost precisely what had been asked of this mission: 99 by 103 nautical miles, or 114 by 118 statute miles. The mission, of course, has not yet been committed to the moon, as we have pointed out here a couple of times this morning. There are several possibilities. If it does not seem to be going well and they do not want to fire off the S-4B third stage for the translunar injection, they can go into a 10-day low Earth orbit, which is a possibility, an alternate mission. They could go into a high ellipse orbit all the way out to 4,600 miles from Earth and back on a large sort of an oblong orbit. They could, if they elected and want to fire off the third stage but not go into moon orbit, they could go on that so-called free return trajectory out to the moon and letting the whiplash effect of the moon's gravity send them back to safe landing here on Earth. Or they could go into an even higher orbit around the Earth called a semi-synchronous orbit, going out 25,000 miles out. Any of these are alternate missions which they have full flight plans ready for, if indeed that's what they choose to do. In Downey, California, at the North American plant where Apollo was built, we have a full-scale mock-up of the Apollo spacecraft. Correspondent Bill Stout, who was with test astronaut Leo Krupp. Gentlemen, Paul Haney said a moment ago, the anxious business of checking out the spacecraft is underway. And I wonder, Bill, if maybe you could show us what this checkout consists of.
Right, Walter. Leo, what are they doing right now? We've gotten through these first critical points that Walter has described to us, but at this moment, what is Borman doing, Lovell and Andrews?
Well, at this moment, Bill, all three astronauts have removed their helmet and gloves, so they're in the same configuration that I'm in here with the pressure suit, but without the helmet and gloves. Each crew member has a checklist he's going over to make sure that all the spacecraft systems are operating properly. Borman is taking care of this side of the panel, setting up his switches, checking out his systems. Jim Lovell is probably down in the lower equipment bay right now, unstowing some of the camera gear, getting it set up. And another important task he'll be performing is on the guidance and navigation system. He will make sure that the optics covers are jettisoned. He'll have to insert the eyepieces and slew the sextant in shaft until he reaches a certain point. This hits a spring which ejects the covers. If the covers would not eject, he would not be able to take star sightings.
I see. And there are covers on the outside of the spacecraft that keep these eyepieces from being damaged, I suppose, in launch.
Yes, they're put on to prevent any contamination from getting on the lenses during tower jettison and staging and so forth. And they will be jettisoned at this time, though, and Jim will make sure that they are jettisoned before they go into translunar injection.
You say it's a simple spring-loading device,
That's right, and it's triggered when he slews the sextant and shaft. After he reaches a certain point, this trips the spring and the covers are ejected.
It seems so simple, and yet this early in the flight, if these spring-loaded devices fail to work, if in effect they were blinded within the spacecraft, would that be a serious enough problem, do you think, for them to change the nature of the mission?
Well, this would be a NASA decision. They would have to evaluate if the other systems are functioning, if they would be willing to go without the optics. But this would preclude optical sighting from the spacecraft if the covers did not come off. They could use a backup method of sighting through the window using the COAS, or the Collimated Optical Alignment Sight. So there is a backup means of navigating using the crewman's sight through this window rather than using the sextant and telescope.
So even the small matters, Walter, can be very important at this critical point in the flight. Back to you.
CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment.
There's one traffic network in this country where there are almost never any traffic jams. The Bell Telephone Network, with equipment made and supplied by Western Electric. Oh, the Bell System network has traffic problems, too, like over 300 million phone calls a day. But there are millions of routes to choose from, and there's switching equipment to get you through.
I'm glad I got through so fast. I'll never make that plane. You wouldn't believe this traffic, bumper to bumper.
Western Electric. We make Bell telephones. We also make equipment for the network that keeps your phone calls from getting stuck in traffic. Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System.
This is Walter Cronkite back at our CBS News Space Center. The one thing we have not mentioned in the flight of Apollo 8, I don't think, this morning, is the fact that we are expecting to get television pictures from Apollo 8. It's equipped with that 4.5-pound RCA camera, and the astronauts expect, according to their flight plan, to make their first transmission from the spacecraft tomorrow afternoon around 3 o'clock. They'll make another on the way out to the moon. Then they'll make 2 transmissions from the moon itself, that is, while they're orbiting the moon, another on Christmas Day on their way back from the moon, and a 6th transmission is expected on Thursday. Terry Drinkwater is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Terry, what are they doing out there right now?
Yes, Walter, they're watching just as everyone else is in the country, watching and are very happy here. They're thinking back to all that has gone on here in unmanned exploration of the moon. And that, Walter, began with this little vehicle nearly 10 years ago. This is the Pioneer. Pioneer 4 came within 37,000 miles of the lunar surface. And for the United States, that was the start. And after Pioneer came this spacecraft. This is Ranger. It sent back the first close-up pictures of the moon's surface, pictures which revealed details never seen before through telescopes.
Men on Earth could see for the first time tiny craters on the moon as small as 10 inches across. Surveyor, the next craft, was equipped for soft landing, settling gently on the lunar surface, photographing and probing with its shovel. One purpose of Surveyor was to scout prospective Apollo landing sites. Surveyor demonstrated the feasibility of landing men on the moon. Next, the Lunar Orbiter series. Flight control for Lunar Orbiter was here at JPL, but this vehicle was the project of NASA's Langley Research Center. Orbiter went around and around the moon, photo mapping almost all of the lunar surface, including the far dark side. In all, the Rangers, Surveyor, and Lunar Orbiters have shown that it's possible and safe for men to go around the moon and later to land on it. More than 100,000 close-up pictures of the lunar surface have been taken by all of these vehicles, and now, if all continues to go well, those 3 astronauts will get the first personal close-up view of the moon. Walter?
Matter of fact, Terry, I think that 45 objects have now been launched at the moon since man's first attempt to get out there at all with anything. That was the first United States attempt, which was a failure, on August 17th, 1958. 27 of these 45 attempts have been American. 18 of them have been Soviet. 16 have failed to reach the moon, or they have bypassed it. 7 of them have done that, to go into solar orbit. That includes, among the failures, the first 7 American attempts, the U.S. Pioneer program, which literally barely got off the ground, or didn't get off the ground. Then 10 of the 45 attempts have impacted the moon. 4 Soviets and the rest American. 4 have been successful in relaying information back that before they impacted the moon, that is, before they crashed into the moon. Some accidentally crashed, attempting a soft landing, and reported nothing. Others, like the U.S. Ranger series, sent back most successful photos in their last few minutes before hitting the moon's surface, and some 1,700 pictures altogether from the Ranger series. The Russians got the first impact on the moon, incidentally, with their Luna 2 in September 1959. 7 of the 45 objects have soft landed on the moon, 2 of them Russians, 5 of them U.S. surveyors, and it is perfectly possible that these men in the Apollo 8 could conceivably see from 70 miles high one of those surveyors, or pick up at least a glimmer of light from one. 9 others have orbited the moon, and 3 have gone around the moon and returned to Earth. 1 to a hard landing on Earth. There wasn't any attempt to recover it. 2 the recent zone flights of the Russians. Borman, Lovell, and Anders are now in orbit, some 9,000 hours until they make their try for the moon, it says here. That doesn't have anything to do with fact. We'll take that back. We'll be reporting briefly every half hour at any rate on their progress this morning as they orbit the Earth and prepare for translunar injection, for beginning their flight, actually on the way to the moon. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News Space Center.
This has been the CBS News Special Report, The Flight of Apollo 8, brought to you by Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell system. The people who